Johannesburg skyline gleamed like polished diamonds as Kwame Okonkwo stood on the rooftop of his penthouse, watching the city he owned sprawl beneath him. At 35, he had more wealth than most nations, yet his heart felt like a vault with no key. "Another gala tonight, sir." His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. 300 of Johannesburg's most elite. 300 strangers, Kwame thought bitterly. 300 people who loved his money more than his name. He had been betrayed twice. Once by his fiancée who confessed she only married him for his fortune, and once by his business partner who nearly ruined his family's import empire. Both had taught him the same painful lesson. Love, in his world, was a commodity like any other. That evening, as Kwame dressed in his hand-tailored Italian suit, his eyes fell upon an old photograph tucked in his drawer. His grandfather as a young man, standing proudly in front of a small mechanic shop in Accra, Ghana. The old man had built his fortune from nothing, brick by brick, and had always said that the truest measure of a person's character revealed itself in hardship, not luxury. An idea was born. By midnight, Kwame had set his affairs in order. He transferred temporary control to his most trusted deputy, told his staff he was taking a sabbatical, and withdrew enough cash to live modestly for several months. The next morning, Kwame Okonkwo ceased to exist. In his place emerged Kojo Mensah, a man with a weathered face, a worn jacket, and a story designed to break hearts. The Pikine district of Dakar, Senegal, was nothing like the gleaming towers of Johannesburg. Here, the streets were narrow and alive with the symphony of daily struggle. Hawkers calling out prices, children laughing, the metallic ring of hammers on metal. Kwame had chosen Dakar deliberately, far from anyone who might recognize him, and close to his family's ancestral roots. The garage he found was run by an elderly man named Ousmane, who had owned it for 40 years. The building leaned slightly, as if tired from decades of holding itself upright. Its exterior was a patchwork of faded red paint and rust, but inside, the workspace was immaculate. Every tool hung in its place, every surface organized, every job done with precision. "You know mechanics?" Ousmane asked, studying the stranger with sharp, intelligent eyes. "I know engines," Kwame replied truthfully. In his former life, he owned a car collection worth millions. More importantly, his grandfather had taught him about mechanics before the family business expanded into trade and import. "And I'm honest work, for modest pay." Ousmane hired him that day. For the first month, Kwame worked in silence, learning the rhythm of the garage and the neighborhood. He fixed transmissions and aligned wheels, patched fuel tanks and rebuilt engines. His hands, which had only known silk handkerchiefs and golf club handles, developed calluses. His Armani watches were replaced with a plastic knockoff that showed the correct time often enough. His penthouse became a small room above a corner shop that smelled perpetually of fried plantains. And for the first time in years, Kwame slept peacefully. The rains came in August, heavy and sudden, as if the sky had finally remembered to weep. Kwame was underneath a customer's pickup truck when the door to the garage burst open, bringing with it a gust of wind and a young woman drenched in rainwater. "Please," she gasped, her words tumbling over themselves. "Please, I know you're busy, but my car, it died on me 3 miles from here. I walked the whole way in this rain, and I have to be somewhere. I have to." Kwame slid out from beneath the truck and found himself looking at Aisha Diallo. She was perhaps 28, with skin the color of dark honey and eyes that held the kind of intelligence that made a person feel genuinely seen. Her hair was wrapped in a deep indigo cloth, and water dripped from her simple cotton dress. But it was her eyes that caught him. They sparkled with an urgency that transcended her immediate problem. "Where do you have to be?" he asked gently. "The Street Cecilia Orphanage," she said. "It's Sister Margaret's birthday, and I promised I'd be there to help with the celebration. The children are counting on me, and—" She paused, as if realizing she was pouring her heart out to a stranger. "I'm sorry. I'm just so worried I'll miss it." Something in her voice touched a part of Kwame that he thought had calcified long ago. "Describe the car to me." She did, and though the rain hammered down outside, Kwame worked with a focus that impressed even Ousmane, who watched from the corner with a knowing smile. The problem was a faulty alternator and a dead battery. Within 2 hours, the old Peugeot wheezed back to life. "How much?" Aisha asked, reaching into her soaked purse with trembling hands. Kwame looked at her. This woman who had walked 3 miles in a downpour for children she didn't even know were waiting. This woman whose worry for others outweighed her worry for herself. "Nothing," he said. "Consider it a blessing." Tears mixed with rainwater on her cheeks. "God bless you, stranger. Truly." She paused at the door. "Would you like to come? To the orphanage. Sister Margaret always makes too much food, and we have music and dancing. It would mean so much to the children to meet a kind man." Kwame should have said no. This was not part of the plan. The plan was observation, not participation. The plan was to understand love from a distance before diving in. He went anyway. The Street Cecilia Orphanage was housed in a renovated colonial building painted a hopeful shade of yellow. Inside, approximately 40 children ranging from 3 to 16 filled the space with their boundless energy. Sister Margaret was a round, warm woman in her 60s with a laugh that seemed to come from the core of the earth, and she welcomed Kwame as if he were the birthday gift himself. But it was Aisha who held his attention. She moved through the orphanage like water finding its course, kneeling to help a shy 4-year-old tie her shoe, organizing games for the older children, ensuring every child received a plate of food and a slice of cake. She sang off-key during the birthday song. She played a spirited game of tag with the littlest children. She sat with a withdrawn 7-year-old named Musa, patiently listening to his story about the bird he'd seen, her full attention devoted to the boy as if he were the most important person in the world. Kwame had moved in circles of power, had attended functions with presidents and celebrities, had negotiated billion-dollar deals. But he had never seen anyone radiate such genuine love. He asked Sister Margaret about Aisha as the evening wound down. "Aisha?" The nun smiled. "She comes twice a week, sometimes more. She has a job at a museum, but somehow she finds time for the children. She was one of these children once, orphaned at 8, raised here until 18. She could have forgotten about us, but she never did." "Why?" Kwame asked. "Because," Sister Margaret said simply, "she remembers what it feels like to be forgotten by the world." Over the following months, Kwame and Aisha developed a routine. She began arriving at the garage on Friday afternoons, ostensibly to help Ousmane with his paperwork. The old man ran his business with almost no records, but really to spend time with Kojo, the quiet, kind mechanic who asked thoughtful questions and listened to her answers as if they contained great wisdom. They took walks through Dakar's colonial quarter, her hand sometimes finding his. They sat in tea shops discussing books and dreams. Kwame, as Kojo, shared carefully crafted stories about a difficult childhood, about always feeling like an outsider, about learning that money couldn't buy happiness because he'd never had any to begin with. All of it was rooted in truth, though the truth was inverted. Aisha, in turn, shared her world with him. She took him to the museum where she worked as a curator of traditional West African art. She showed him artifacts that had survived centuries, masks and sculptures and textiles, each one a story of survival and beauty. She introduced him to her modest circle of friends, all of whom worked in education or social services, people whose wealth was measured not in money but in the positive change they brought to their communities. One evening, as they sat on a roof overlooking the Atlantic, Aisha turned to him with tears in her eyes. "I'm falling in love with you," she said simply. "And I'm terrified." Kwame felt his heart split open like a seed. "Why terrified?" "Because you're too good to be true. Because someone like you, so kind, so genuine, deserves so much more than I can offer. I have no family. My job barely pays enough for rent and food. I spend most of my money on the orphanage and volunteering. I can't give you the life you deserve." He took her hands in his. "Aisha, you are the life I deserve. I spent years chasing things that didn't matter, and I was empty inside. You've given me something real." She kissed him then, there on that rooftop with the ocean wind in their hair and the stars bearing witness. And for the first time in his life, Kwame felt he had truly found something worth more than all the diamonds in Johannesburg. 3 months into their relationship, Kwame received a phone call that shattered everything. His mother had suffered a stroke. He was in the garage when the call came, and he had to excuse himself, his hands shaking as he listened to his deputy's urgent voice. His mother was in the ICU in Johannesburg. The doctors were optimistic, but they needed him there. They needed him to authorize treatments and be with her through the surgery. Kwame looked around the garage, at the simple tools that had become his friends, at the work that had filled his days with purpose. Then he looked at his phone, at Aisha's most recent message. "Missing you. See you tonight? I made your favorite jollof rice." He had to leave. There was no way around it. He found Aisha at the orphanage, where she spent Friday mornings teaching the children about art history. "I have to go," he said. The words felt inadequate. "There's been a family emergency. I have to return to Johannesburg." Aisha's face fell. "For how long?" "I don't know. My mother," he stopped. He couldn't lie to her anymore. "Not about this. She's very ill. I need to be there." "Of course," Aisha said immediately, her own concerns dissolving in the face of his pain. "Family comes first. I'll wait for you. How long do you think?" Kwame didn't answer. He couldn't. Because waiting for him meant waiting for a man who didn't exist. A man who was about to vanish from her life as completely as morning fog. Back in Johannesburg, Kwame moved through the nightmare of his mother's illness and recovery with the automatic motions of a dutiful son. She recovered well, thank God. The stroke had been mild, and her doctors predicted a full rehabilitation. But Kwame was dying inside. He moved through his penthouse like a ghost, haunted by Aisha's face when he'd left. His colleagues were thrilled to have him back. The business was thriving, and his bank account had swollen another 100 million while he'd been away. None of it mattered. None of it had ever mattered. He tried calling Aisha multiple times, but after the first week, she stopped answering. He hired a private investigator to check on her, only to discover that she'd asked to be left alone and had taken a temporary leave from the museum. She was still volunteering at the orphanage, still helping the children, but she'd created a careful distance from the life she and Kojo had built together. After 3 weeks of torture, Kwame made a decision. He left the business in his deputy's capable hands, returned to Dakar, and found Aisha at the orphanage, teaching the children to paint with natural dyes. When she saw him, her hands stopped moving. A brush fell into a bowl of indigo, unnoticed. "I can explain," he said, though he wasn't sure where to begin. "There's nothing to explain," she said quietly, her back still to him as she spoke to the children. "Children, why don't you take your paintings outside and show Sister Margaret? Tell her Aisha will be in a moment." The children scattered, sensing the electricity in the room. Once they were gone, Aisha finally turned to him. "You're from there, aren't you? From the wealthy world." It wasn't a question. "I found out last week. A woman came to the orphanage, looking for someone. She showed me a photograph from a magazine. You were in it, but you looked different, clean, polished, cold. The caption said you were a billionaire business owner." "Aisha, let me finish. At first, I thought you'd been playing with me, that this was some rich man's joke, playing at poverty to see how the other half lived. But that didn't feel right. So I did more research. I found articles about your mother's stroke. It happened the day you left. You weren't running away from me. You were running toward her." She stepped closer, and her eyes were not angry, but searching. "So tell me the truth, not the story. Tell me who you really are." And so Kwame did. He told her about his wealth and his loneliness, about his desire to find someone who would love him for himself, about his grandfather's wisdom and his own foolishness in believing he had to lie to find authenticity. He told her about the betrayals that had taught him to see love as a transaction. He told her about the 3 months in Dakar, working in the garage, going to the orphanage, falling in love with a woman who didn't know his name and didn't care about his money. "I was wrong," he finished. "Wrong to lie, wrong to believe that deception could lead to truth. But Aisha, everything I felt for you was real. Every moment was honest, even if my story wasn't." She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Do you know what I love about the Kojo I knew?" she finally asked. It wasn't his poverty or his status. It was the way he listened, the way he noticed things, the way he made me feel like my life, my small, ordinary life, was important. I felt seen by him, truly seen. She paused. Is that man still in there? Under the billionaire's clothes and the business world's expectations? Yes, Kwame said. He never left. Then I need to know you, Aisha continued. The real you, not the story, not the persona. I need to know Kwame Okonkwo as completely as I knew Kojo Mensah. And that's going to take time and honesty and a willingness to let me into all of you, including the parts that are complicated and wealthy and powerful. Can you do that? Kwame took her hand. I can. I will. What happened next was not the reconciliation anyone would have written into a script. Aisha demanded honesty, and Kwame gave it to her. But she refused to simply return to being his girlfriend. Instead, she proposed something that shocked everyone around them. She would work alongside him in his business, learning the world he inhabited, and he would continue his connection to the orphanage, the garage, and the community in Dakar. You can't live a double life, she said, but you can live an integrated one. The wealthy businessman and the man who believes in service, they should be the same person. Over the next 6 months, Aisha became the executive director of Kwame's newly established foundation, dedicated to education and care for vulnerable children across West Africa. She used her expertise in curation and storytelling to create programs that didn't simply provide aid, but preserved dignity and celebrated culture. The garage in Dakar was expanded and formalized into a technical training program for young people in underserved areas. But the real revolution happened within Kwame himself. Working with Aisha, he realized that his entire business structure had been built on exploitation, importing goods from developing nations at prices that kept producers impoverished, then selling them at markups that benefited only the wealthy. Together, they reimagined the company. They started paying fair wages and sustainable prices. They invested in training and development in the communities they sourced from. They created profit-sharing models that allowed their suppliers to build their own wealth. His executive team was horrified. Profits would decrease, they warned. His competitors would destroy him in the market. They were right about the profits. They were wrong about the consequences. Within a year, Kwame's company had become a model for ethical business in West Africa. Other companies, ashamed by comparison, began adopting similar practices. Young people wanted to work for an organization with a soul. Customers paid premium prices for products made with integrity. The business didn't shrink. It transformed, becoming smaller in pure monetary terms but infinitely larger in purpose. One evening, 18 months after returning to Dakar, Kwame stood with Aisha on the roof overlooking the Atlantic, the same place where she'd first confessed her love. I want to marry you, he said, producing not a diamond ring, but a simple band of Senegalese gold, crafted by an artisan they'd met in the community. I know, Aisha smiled. I've known for months. How? Because I've watched you become the man I fell in love with, but better. You've integrated the best of both worlds, the power and resources of the billionaire with the humility and purpose of the mechanic. You're whole now, Kwame. That's when I knew. They married 6 weeks later in the garden of St. Cecilia Orphanage, with the children dancing and Sister Margaret crying happy tears and Ousmane, the old garage owner, playing the talking drum. For their honeymoon, they worked side by side in the garage, Kwame teaching Aisha how to rebuild an engine, and Aisha teaching Kwame the names of all the children who'd come through the orphanage over the years. They drove north to Ouagadougou and south to Cape Town, meeting with communities where their foundation worked, understanding the real impact of their efforts. The financial press called it the greatest transformation in West African business in a generation. Kwame Okonkwo, the billionaire who had walked away from traditional wealth to find authentic love, had created a model for capitalism that centered human dignity. But that was not the real story. The real story was simpler and more profound. A man had been so empty that he had to strip away everything to find what mattered. He had to become poor to understand that love cannot be bought. He had to lie to learn the value of truth. He had to leave himself behind to finally find himself. And the woman he loved had been wise enough to see through his disguise not to his money, but to his heart. Years later, when people asked Kwame how he'd found true love, he would smile and say, "I didn't find it. I had to lose everything else first so I could finally see it." Aisha, standing beside him, would squeeze his hand and add, "And I had to be willing to see him, not as Kojo the mechanic or Kwame the billionaire, but as both and neither, as simply the man he chose to become." In a modest house in Dakar, surrounded by art from the museum Aisha had left to pursue her passion, surrounded by the sounds of the community they served, surrounded by the love they had built together, they lived not happily ever after. Because life is more complicated than that, but meaningfully, purposefully, and most importantly, together. The truth they discovered was far more valuable than any fortune. And it was enough.